start with a strengths focus. Like, what are they actually good at? What are they motivated by? What do they care about? And then try and meet them there. I think there's a lot more that I would want to see at a more like systemic level. But if you're within the system and you've only got, there's limits to how much like actual leverage you have. That I think that's one where you have some real influence.
Hey, you found Ways We Learn, an investigation of how learning happens across all ages and modalities. Let's go learn something. Hi, folks, and welcome back to Ways We Learn. I'm Sean, and I'm here with Brian. And as we start today, I want you to just think about your experience with education. So it might be a long time ago, or it might be more recently, but at some point, you've had some kind of organized learning experience. And I want you to think about, in general, what that experience was like. For many of us, organized learning was sort of like a factory. A bunch of students along for the ride, not necessarily wanting to be there, but ingesting a lot of information that was handed down by a teacher. And if your typical educational experiences were much like mine, they probably involved a big and maybe scary test at the end to see how you did. Now I want you to think about a time you've played a game. Potentially, you found the game more enjoyable than some of your learning experiences. And there's lots of potential reasons for that, but to name a few, you're more active in a game, you get quick feedback in a game, and a game is really meant to be fun, even in that big scary test at the end. Today, we're speaking with someone who thinks education can and should be more like games. Seth Trudeau is the founder and managing director of Routine Chaos, where he works with companies to build transformative products through deep product discovery and rigorous product development. As a product and service designer focused primarily in education and workforce development, he's built games, simulations, and applications for learners from primary school up through postgraduate studies. He began his career teaching history in the US before he founded an NGO in South Sudan working with orphans and vulnerable children. He was also part of the founding team for the African Leadership University and the VP of product for its spin-off ALX. And he has a master's degree from Stanford in learning, design, and technology. So Seth, thank you for joining us and welcome to Ways We Learn.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
So Seth, the place I'd like to start is like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember the idea of gamification coming into education, early 2011, 2012. I think Foursquare popularized gamification, and then everybody in the space was like, "Oh, this is a panacea for learning," as we often do. And then like around, 2016 and on, it became persona non grata. Like it didn't live up, like MOOCs and like all the other panaceas that have come into the education space, it didn't live up to its hype. So why bring this back into the game now, right? Did we throw some of the baby out with the bathwater, or like, what's your thinking around gamification? Why does it still interest you?
So it's funny that you think about the beginning of it at 2011. And by the way, for like the podcast listeners, they can't see that.
That's when it
you
came
say
into my
gamification,
notice.
like I am like suppressing my gag reflex and like my eyes are rolling out of control.
Yes, exactly.
So I think what you're identifying as like kind of the first big moment is actually probably like the third wave of gamification that I can think of, right? So I think actually the first wave of gamification comes around the time of like the advent of the personal computer, like late 1980s. So if you think about what you get in that period, there's like actually a bunch of like absolute classics, like bangers only, that are landing on like the Apple IIe in like 1989, 1990. So like, do you guys play the Oregon Trail or Number Munchers?
I died of dysentery a lot.
Yeah. You learn to not ford the river. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego and all of its spinoffs? That was like real like gamification within education. And so that's probably like the very first wave where it happens. And I think probably like similarly to what you said in 2011, I think what happens there is that we get a little too carried away with the hype, and try to do like everything like this, and suddenly you get like, I mean, I can't even think of like the bad examples. They don't stick in my mind. But it's like we tried to make a game out of every single thing. And as a result, like 98% of it sucked. It was terrible. So I think that was like wave one. I think wave two comes like early 2000s, and it's more around like just educational media. And so you got a lot of like CD-ROMs that had like recognizable intellectual property, where there was like this blend of animated storytelling and like little mini games baked into it. And so in that case, it was a really different thing, because it was really a lot more of like the evolution of like a mashup of the game and like the digital book. So I think that's kind of like the second wave of that. And then I think what you identified as like the beginning of gamification is actually the beginning of the third wave of gamification. And I don't know how to describe that. Part of the reason that I think it's maybe the worst of the three waves is because what gamification looked like, if you look at the other two, the gamification wave in education actually looked like cosmetically similar to the kinds of like mainstream games that were out there. So like, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego looks a lot like other PC games that are coming out at the time. The like Berenstain Bears Story Hour or whatever it was called. Similar in terms of like its interface and the way that it works to something like Myst. So like the games for education are still kind of like in the same language as like the mainstream games. If you look at 2011, it's really like what I would just call like, let's just attach points to it. It's just like, it's a Skinner box that we're calling a game. Meanwhile, mainstream games have evolved like so far beyond, like all of the AAA games that you're seeing at about that time are so much more complex, and there's so much more like depth of engagement. And on the education side, it's like, here's a monster, and if you're good, the monster gets more points, and then they can buy a berry or a hat. And it's pretty weak.
I want to key in on a couple things from that. So first, you mentioned the Skinner box. Can you just describe what that is? Because people who have studied education may know what you're talking about and others may not.
Yeah, of course. We've probably seen it in lots of different ways and lots of different forms, but in the 1950s, mid 20th century, it's an educational psychologist named B.F. Skinner who comes up with a super influential theory in education, which is behaviorism. His basic idea is that you can condition any sort of behavior, positively or negatively, through a system of rewards and consequences. And so when someone does the thing they're supposed to do, they get some sort of positive reinforcement. When they do the thing they're not supposed to do, they get some sort of negative reinforcement. And he designed at the time like an actual physical box that was it was like a teaching machine, but that has become the physical machine versus even like digital or virtual machines. And also just approaches to pedagogy a lot of them have been very influenced by behaviorism.
In the early days, so was the educational gaming sort of was it tracking with the developments in the normal gaming space, so to speak? So like, you had the 2D side scrollers, and so you had Oregon Trail, and then did like RPGs open up something in the space? Like where did the divergence happen between these waves? Like, why didn't education keep up with the third wave of games? Just like creation costs too high?
I'm going to guess it's money. Yeah.
I think it probably was. If you look at some of those early games, what's really interesting is something like Oregon Trail. If I remember right, the company that developed it was actually like a nonprofit, I believe. And so, yeah, I think some of it comes down to the fact that your cost of development was lower. And then I think probably another aspect of it was just like platform divergence. So if you look through, and actually, I mean, this is kind of indicative of when you see these waves reemerging. So like your like 80s, early 90s, you could develop pretty much exclusively for PC/Mac. I mean, really, you were developing for Apple IIe. That was where educational games went, single platform.
Right.
You probably lose the ability to keep up when you start to see that the game landscape diversifies again. So by the mid 90s, if you wanted to have something that had reach, you needed to develop for Mac, you had to develop for PC, you probably had to be developing for Nintendo and for Sega. And that's just a lot more development work. So then you see it kind of come back again. If you look at, that early 2000, like late 90s, early 2000s, it refocused onto the PC. And then also there was like kind of a fringe movement that was more just like distribution of games on the internet. So again, like singular platform. And then you're like late aughts, early teens is coming because a lot of it's focused on like mobile/iPad type applications.
Gotcha. Do you think would you point to any great educational games now that exist? Maybe board games or card games, Duolingo. Like who out there do you look at now and say, these people are doing it right? I'm really impressed by what they're doing.
There's a lot of them, and I think there's some really great ones that the best 2 or 3 off the top of my head are not educational games. They're just games that have been co-opted for educational purposes. So the clear best in class, as far as I'm concerned, is Minecraft. Minecraft is a phenomenal education game, both in terms of like hard skills around thinking about like the actual physics of how you build things, but also a lot of the soft skills are around like collaboration and planning. Like there are some amazing Minecraft servers that are doing like that. The one that I always think about is there's a Minecraft server where they have recreated the entire Song of Ice and Fire world, Game of Thrones. Like it's like hundreds of people, and they've got all of these like behind the scenes collaboration and planning tools that they're using. And it's like impeccable to the point that you were making at the top, Sean. That's not the kind of experience that culminates in a big high pressure test. Exactly. And that's what's interesting about Minecraft is it's not in the create mode. It's not like a leveled game that has bosses and things like that, but it's a phenomenal education game. I think SimCity similarly has those dynamics to it. And then if either of you guys have played Tears of the Kingdom, the newest Legend of Zelda, oh my gosh, it's mind blowing. Because the new dynamic that they've introduced in it is, or I guess the mechanic that they've introduced in it is a building mechanic where you have to actually be looking at the way that machines work and how to power different things and the different kinds of momentum and movement and how that all works together. People are building wild stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I think those are really high quality learning.
So what you're actually pointing towards here too is a difference between sort of information ingesting, which is what like number crunchers may have been, right? To help you like continuously practice, and a more skills, conceptual, principles based type of learning, and sort of the things that are like you wouldn't find in a textbook specifically. That seems to be where gaming is really valuable right now in your mind.
Yeah, I think so. Because I think in general, I'm skeptical and not very enthusiastic about just the whole information transfer approach. I think for lots of reasons that is not what we should be doing in terms of education. And I think what you're probably going to get with those kind of games, I don't think it's bad for a game to be like just a quick hit. You play it once or twice and move on. Like, I think that's okay. It's hard to justify the investment to develop something like that for an educational context. But I think that's probably most of what you're going to get out of a kind of like information transfer, rote memorization type of game.
Gotcha.
If I can, I want to push back on that for a second because,
Yeah.
and I'm sort of in the middle of all of this, just the way that I think about education, and there's definite value in this. But I think if you were to talk to someone who's more of a traditional educationalist, they would point to the evidence that has been gathered from years of research. There's evidence that information transfer followed by directed practice is the actual most effective and efficient way of learning. And I can put a link to that article in the episode notes. But I guess my question is, so what you're describing is an immersive sort of situational learning, right? If you're trying to learn, I don't know, physics or whatever it is that's happening in the Zelda game, you're actually applying them as you learn them.
Mm-hmm.
And what a more traditionalist approach would be is, well, let me just tell you what these things are, right? And then I'm going to show you how to do them, and then you're going to do them, and it's going to happen a lot faster than if you go and play Legend of Zelda. So what is the counter to that? Why is this a more valuable way to learn?
The counter to me would be that in terms of the evidence, I think I know a lot of the research you're talking about, but if I'm off here, then let me know. But I think in a lot of cases, what you're talking about is almost circular in its logic, just in that the information transfer approach is the most efficient way in terms of assessing based on accumulation of information. But if you then extend that into, and what can you do? If you then go back to think about what is like the actual application of this, how do you use it? I think more situated learning ends up being a lot more enduring. Whereas I think in a lot of cases, information transfer works well for kind of information recitation assessment. And I don't think that's surprising. And I mean, I also think, like, to your point, there is a place for it. There's a place where doing the thing in Zelda and being able to understand that there is actually like a defined concept of what this is and how it works. There's a way that you can formally actually work through how many Zonai charges you need in order to power something. Like, there is real value in that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not saying that it's exclusively one or the other, but I think we have over-indexed on that information transfer piece. And in a lot of cases, so like, this is stuff you'll see if you think of it even in a more traditional context. The guy like Dan Meyer, who's at Desmos and who has been writing about math education for 2 decades or something like that, looks at the fact that what you want before you even start to introduce any of the formal stuff is you need that first hook. Like, what gets into the kid so that they actually care about it, so that they see the value of it, they see the utility of it. And it's only when they're already starting to see that it's useful to start to bring in more of the formal definition and understanding.
I love that you went there. Yeah, I was hoping you'd go there. The article that I was mentioning, and I'm sure you're familiar with, is by Kirshner. It's Why Minimal Guidance During Instruction Does Not Work. I was trying not to geek out too much on this, but the thing that you just mentioned, the motivation, is for me one of the primary reasons for using a game. And just in my own experience, it's been kind of fascinating to watch my own daughter. We've been playing Super Mario U on the Switch, and when we finished it, she wanted to go back and master it. And we've been going back through, the early levels, and it's so easy for her because of the scaffolding that's inherently built into good gameplay and the motivation that she had to master it. And that's something that you don't often see, at least in sort of early education, where it's, okay, next is math class, and then after that is English class, and you're going to do it because that's the next thing on your schedule. One of the principles of adult learning, if you go to some of the seminal adult learning theory, is motivation and meaning. And that really applies to children as well. It's really a human thing, not an adult thing. And that is what's so good about games, about well-designed games, that just isn't present in a lot of education. So I just love that you went there.
To piggyback off this a little bit, you talked about in the blog post a bit more on gamification. You talk about gamification specifically as or it can be a short-term bridge from an initial spark of interest to achieving a level of competence, but it won't necessarily be sustained. I think that's a very key point. There's a lot of interesting points in there. There has to be some initial level of interest, though regardless of why that interest exists in the first place, which is also an interesting point. So you go on from there to talk about a game that was developed, and I don't know if you developed it, but to teach safety standards to train operators. I'm fascinated by this. It seems like a story-based game. I'm hoping they got I hope they got character sheets and things like that, like in Dungeons and Dragons. What was this like? Like, what was your experience of it? Tell us about this, and also from the lens of gamification.
So this was not me. I did not develop this, although I would love to be able to take credit for it. This was one that I saw at a conference, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 years ago. But it was, I believe it was in Spain, if I remember right. And yeah, I mean, it was essentially just that they had this safety training that all of the train conductors had to go through every year. You know, you had to keep like leveling up and keeping your certification up to date. And they hated it because we would all hate it because that stuff is terrible. Like this is like a clear case where it's like, oh, there's a way to do this. It's like, it doesn't have to like blow the lights out. You don't need to develop Grand Theft Auto Train Edition with like incredibly complex rendering. They're motivated to do it. They have like an actual, it's actually like an extrinsic motivation, which is that they need to keep their certification up to date so that they can keep doing their jobs. That's it. But this thing is terrible. And so you just need to give it just needs to be a bit better. And I mean, really all it was, it was a story-based game. It was digital. I think it was a PC game. And I mean, basically, I think the way that it worked was there were all kinds of different potential threats on the train, like somebody trying to take over the train, or like the train was at risk of running off the tracks. And if it did, it might destroy a town or something like it. You know, it was like just these fantastical scenarios. And in order to solve the scenarios, you had to do the right safety compliance things. That was it. So it's what you would have done anyway with like online videos or somebody in a class going through a slide deck or whatever it already was. And this was just like, oh, okay, cool. It's just a little bit better. And they were down for it.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I don't know exactly what they're doing now, but the military and how they use gameplay for learning. And they're big on situated learning like that. And it's such an incredible way to demonstrate understanding and ability. And, you know, obviously it's in a false scenario and it's on a computer instead of in real life and all of that stuff. But I mean, when you compare that to taking like a bubble test or something, it's just so much better for actually evaluating how someone would respond in a situation. And those live situations, you don't have time to just, you know, think about, well, if this answer is wrong, then it's probably not this answer, but you actually have to respond. It's just a better way to do it.
When we were running trainings at Hickory, we used to build a lot of the training programs with and for the companies. And one of the principles we had was one of the first things that we sort of got the company to agree on was make the situation of the training as similar to the operation of the job as you possibly can. And you know, I hadn't thought about this before, but this scenario-based training that you're kind of talking about does that. But it also seems like a great use case for a lot of the ChatGPT, GPT-4 things that are happening now. Have you used any of the scenario-based stuff with these LLMs? Because the LLM in this scenario would be a great dungeon master. And I'm not giving up on the Dungeons and Dragons references for this episode.
Keep them coming. Yeah, actually, I mean, I think this is one of my current favorite use cases for LLMs is if you can engineer a prompt around a specific kind of scenario that can produce novelty every time. So one of the projects I'm working on right now, we were building a bunch of different mini games to help kids work through a creative process. And so one of the games is an idea generation game. It's about like the fact that when you run into an obstacle, you generally want to think about a few different ways to address it rather than just be like, this is the one way and to get fixated on. And so the game kind of uses almost like a Mad Lib setup where it asks you for 5 different kind of random inputs, and then it uses them to generate like a novel existential crisis that you play a series of rounds of games where you're trying to generate ideas and questions around that crisis in order to come up with a plan. But what's fun about it is that it's a completely novel scenario every single time. And they're like, they're hilarious because they take like your 7 inputs and, like, I mean, I think at one point I remember watching one of the, like doing like a gameplay session, and we had a scenario that involved like dirt bikes that had come to life and were torturing humanity by driving around blasting Michael Jackson music at top volume. And that was how they were enslaving humanity. And that's just like, and for the kids, they, you can think about like they had provided like dirt bikes, Michael Jackson, and like it was their scenario that had come to life. They were so bought into it, and they thought it was hilarious and like it's fun because it's imaginative, it's clever, and it's a bit provocative.
I think that was the plot of the latest Terminator, wasn't it?
Probably. I bet it was. But that's the kind of thing where like, if you put the 3 of us in front of a room of 30 kids and we need to come up with 5 novel scenarios on the fly, like, I mean, we could probably do it. It would be real time intensive. We would be completely exhausted at the end of it. And half of the scenarios would probably kind of suck. And the nice thing is, even if that happens with the LLM, if like half the scenarios suck, you just run it again and you've lost 2 minutes and you get to something that, it's like the generation of novelty where it's a scenario where it doesn't need to be precisely correct about something.
That's a great application. I love that.
So I want to move over to your post. What if the Pokemon company took over traditional education? Which is, I think, my all-time favorite question in education right now. I love that. You asked the question in there, what would be meaningfully different if the Pokemon company was in charge of our social pursuit of education? I'd love for you to just start unpacking that. Like, how did you come down this road? Why are you even asking that question? Just give us the story here, Seth.
Sure, because there really is a story. So I have 3 children. I have a 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old. And I think for like any boy around the age of 7 at this point in their lives, it's almost like impossible to avoid Pokemon exposure. Like when my kids first discovered Pokemon, we were living in Mauritius, which is a tiny island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but like Pokemon was there. And, Pokemon is really, it scratches a bunch of itches. It's got like clever looking characters and really good like media support. But for whatever it was, my kids were like interested in Pokemon. Fast forward like a year after that, we now live in the Netherlands. And, for Christmas, we got them like the Pokemon card game. We were like, oh, there's a game about this. We'll get this for them. And a couple months later, my oldest, Thomas, tells me like, hey, I was on the internet and I saw that there's a Pokemon tournament. It's the Pokemon European Championship and it's happening in Frankfurt, Germany. Can we go? And I had no idea, like that sentence was almost incomprehensible to me. I did not know what that meant, but I looked it up and realized that Frankfurt was like a 3-hour train ride away from us. And It was a long weekend when the kids were already off of school. So it just kind of felt like pretty low risk. So I said yes. And I basically told them, like, here's the thing I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure we have train tickets and a hotel. Everything else you guys need to take care of. I have no ability to like navigate what this world is. No idea what we were getting into at all. They registered, my two oldest registered to compete in a Pokemon tournament. And the day came and we went and walked into a giant conference space with, I think I don't know, because it's hard to do these numbers when you just see them. It was definitely over 1,000 people. It was probably somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people of all ages to compete in what turned out to be 3 different versions of Pokemon, which I didn't know before that there's a card game, a video game, and a mobile game. And it was like, my kids were losing their mind. They thought this was the most amazing thing because they've got banners, they've got somebody in a Pikachu costume walking around, they've got all of this stuff going on. I was like completely overwhelmed. I had no idea what we were supposed to be doing, and my kids had signed up for 2 different events. And we ended up like every person that we interacted with, I was like very hesitant because I was like, I have no idea what this scene is. And I'm a little like concerned about the adult people who are still into Pokemon. Every person that we interacted with, whether they were a volunteer, a staff member, just another person attending, was like so kind and encouraging. And like, my kids are like starting to like make friends with other players, and like the judge of the match is like giving them high fives and congratulations and like all of this stuff. And I was like, this is a vibe. Like there's a scene happening here. And like when it's every single person, you know that there's something intentionally designed about it. Because it's one thing if it's like, oh yeah, like if you go to TGI Fridays and the waitress is really nice, like that's just because like that's what that person is paid to do. You should never go to TGI Fridays, by the way. I don't know. You can cut that out if that'll get you into some sort of litigation scenario. But this was everybody across the board, no matter who they were, was like, there was like a proper community around this. And by this like utter fluke, this is our first, we showed up, the kids lost every single match that they played in. But the way that it was set up was so that it's not like a single or double elimination. Everybody's guaranteed a certain number of matches, like 6 matches. So they lost every single one. And by a fluke, my middle son, Nate, was registered in a division where only 8 competitors had showed up. And the rules are that the top 8 finishers win money, $500, and get automatic invites to the Pokemon World Championships, which were happening in London, which is also a 4-hour train ride from our house. And so we ended up going to the Pokemon World Championships that year. And whatever the European Championships had been, London was that like to the 10th power. But it was also the same consistency of experience of this like really kind, supportive community. Thomas came along, even though Thomas didn't qualify, because there were other events and outlets that they could participate in. And the long story short is that basically since April of 2022, I have attended half a dozen Pokemon tournaments, and even my kids convinced me to compete in one of them. And my kids now like have a Pokemon coach, and they like, when we show up to tournaments, they know people. They know like, I don't even know how many people, like by name. And I know people, like I know the other Pokemon parents, like by name. And it's wild. And I just started to think about like, there's something really important happening here in terms of identity formation, in terms of soft skill development, in terms of my kids' abilities to think strategically, even like very hard things like their maths, because you got like these points and hit point systems and things like that that you have to stay on top of. I was like, they're learning really meaningful stuff here, and in a way that I think is very deliberately designed. So that's the long version of the story of how that post came to be.
I would love to know those hard things they're learning, but I'm also curious, is this the first time that they've gone this deep into a subject matter, or is this sort of like the routine chaos of the Trudeau household?
This is definitely, so my oldest, I think, did a Harry Potter phase where there was about a year where Thomas cranked through all 7 Harry Potter books and was kind of sort of obsessive about them. But I think this has gone deeper and now sustained for quite a bit longer. And I think part of that also has to do with the like kind of peer connection of it, that it's not just one of them, it's the two of them together, and they're able to kind of stimulate each other around it. But yeah, I can't think of something else that they have gone as deep into.
One of the things that you mentioned in this post that I thought was fascinating, and I've seen actually a similar type of thing in jiu-jitsu, is mixed age communities with no age-based hierarchies.
Yeah.
Tell me about that interaction, because that's a rare thing to find in an educational setting.
Yeah. Okay, so let me tell you the like moment that triggered it for me. We were at a tournament. Kid had placed high, and as a result, they got these what are called booster boxes. They're boxes of 30 packs of Pokemon cards. And of course, they were like, well, we're opening all of these immediately right here at the tournament. And I was like, oh God. Okay. I'm not going to, I knew I was powerless to stop it. And so they're opening these cards. They know how to go through in a matter of seconds and figure out if there's anything good there. And as they're doing this, all of these adults start to kind of like gravitate. They see what's going on and they start to come over to like look at what the kids are getting. And then of course the kids have their binders full of cards, and their binders are there. And these adults are like, oh, can I look, are you open to trade? Can I look through your binders? And I am immediately like on edge, where I'm like, what's the dynamic here? Like, are these people coming over to like, are they trying to like take advantage? Right. I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. Kids are completely unconcerned, but I just kind of sat back, in part because my brain was fried. I had been at a Pokemon tournament all day, but I was watching what was happening. And what I saw happening was there was like this kind of mutual appreciation. The adults would identify a card and they would be like, oh, wow, you have this one. And one of the kids would be like, oh, yeah, it's my favorite, whatever. And if there was advantage trying to be taken, that would have been the thing, right? Like you find the really good card and you try and like trick them into it. And instead what they were doing was like affirming like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And I started to watch like when there were trades being proposed. And like, I knew enough that I could tell that what they were proposing was like fair value. They start to have conversations. They're like discussing things. They're talking about like different strategy. They've been all watching the tournament. They've seen the best players. They're talking about how the different players are approaching the game. And there was like recognition that the kids in some cases were much more knowledgeable about what was going on than the adults. And the adults were engaging with them as like, oh, I can like learn something from you. We're actually like, they're talking as peers. And I think, you mentioned jujitsu. I think probably like jujitsu, what you have built in here is like a very explicit, like rules-based system where it makes it just a lot easier to externalize and understand expertise. This is similar to anything that you kind of have like a well-recognized human constructed system. This is why something like Stack Exchange works, because it doesn't matter who you are. You can recognize expertise based on how people engage, how they discuss things. That's what I saw happening there.
I want to dig into that because I think there's sort of an implied acceptance when you go into something like jujitsu, or I'm no expert on Pokemon by any stretch, but into a Pokemon tournament where expertise is the thing that's valued the most. And in traditional education, in a lot of at least early and secondary education, it's in many ways about the age, right? You're younger, I'm going to tell you stuff. How would this, if we were to put in a change away from that age-based hierarchy that you talked about, what would that mean for a traditional education experience? And how would that go over?
I think in a lot of ways, it would probably go over poorly with the adults in the room. I think that's probably where the biggest...
That's a diplomatic way of saying that, yeah.
I think that's where a lot of times the biggest obstacle is.
Yeah.
So I think there is clear reason why historically it's been that way. And unfortunately, I think the truth is that the reason for it has really eroded to the point that I'm not even sure that it's totally legitimate anymore beyond like a certain point. And it's that historically, a school, a teacher has been a legitimate like gatekeeper of knowledge, that if you didn't have access to that space, that person and their expertise, the textbook, whatever it might be, there weren't tons of other great avenues to be able to get that. And I just don't think that's true anymore. Like this is just not the reality of the world that we live in, where like, if you want to be an 8-year-old expert on Civil War history, really the only requirement at this point is kind of like literacy and an internet connection. So it changes that. And I think what we have to consider is that it's not just like a pedagogical change. It is a shift in kind of like the power structure of a learning environment, where it has historically been conceived hierarchically. And I don't know that it should be anymore.
Yeah, I would just add to that, though. You said that the gatekeeper for an 8-year-old who wants to be a Civil War buff would be literacy and internet connection. I would add also critical thinking and ability to reason, and not just digest anything you come across, because as we know, there may be information on the internet that's not 100% accurate. And the role of a teacher in many ways, whether or not we're seeing them as that gatekeeper of information, would be to help facilitate understanding and to help someone make sense of things, albeit from their own biases, from their own perspective. And you hope that the perspective is one that's reasonably good. But I think the pushback on that, on what you said, would be, well, actually, an 8-year-old, yes, they could become a Civil War buff. They could also become whatever, a conspiracy theorist, by not having an expert in the room with them. And so I guess I'm sort of bringing that up as the counter argument to that, where yes, the person can get a lot of information online, but they also need to be able to process it well. And particularly in early childhood education, when the brain hasn't developed to the point that an adult brain has, they may lack those critical reasoning and critical thinking skills.
And I would be totally on board with the idea that that's what we want to evolve the primary school learning environment to be more about, is that it's more about the adult in the room as kind of like a coach, a guide, somebody who can introduce like questions for you to like try and navigate some of that more on your own. The thing is, I don't think that what you're saying, which is, I think, exactly what you do want, I'm not sure that that's what's happening in a primary school environment in most cases now. I agree. Anyway. Yeah. And so I think that would actually be great. I think you're spot on that is actually a lot of the value of the adult role, But I just don't see that that's the reality of what's actually happening.
I would completely agree. I think in a lot of cases, it's exactly what you described. I'm the adult in the room, therefore I'm going to tell you the stuff you need to know, as opposed to I'm the expert in the room. I'm going to help facilitate your learning. And I would love to see us move towards that. Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting to me about this is it reminds me of at Schoolhouse, we had a lot of mixed age classrooms, and it was typically bound within like the grade level, within like a 2, maybe 3 grade level in the elementary space band. And what we found that was exceedingly helpful to the teacher, because I talked to all the teachers about it, was that it created sort of a middle for the entire group where an older child who was maybe struggling in some area could mix in with the younger children, or and vice versa. A child who was excelling in some area could start to mix in with the older children. But what you're actually talking about here, I think, is actually slightly different in that instead of creating a middle, when you break down this age barrier and sort of interest and skill take over, you kind of give birth to a bunch of niches, it sounds like. And that, I think that's what I'm taking away when you talk about multiple modes of participation that were available at these tournaments, and that not everybody had to compete. Is that does that underlying logic structure make sense to you about what was actually happening?
Yeah, I think that's right.
And what were those multiple modes of participation that people could go into at these tournaments?
So I think your diagnosis is right. And I also just want to, like, before we go down that specific question, I also think that what you're talking about as far as the approach that you had at Schoolhouse is also a really interesting one. And I'm not sure that, like, I'm certainly not trying to advocate for like a single design approach to how you think about these spaces, but more about like some of the principles, like kind of what, what I'm hearing as far as what you're saying at Schoolhouse has to do with a way that it almost allows you to move away from like this singular monolithic conception of intelligence, where if you're, this happens, I think, a lot in schools, where if you're smart, you're smart. You're assumed to be smart across the board in everything. Whereas, like, actually, I think it's more complicated than that, that everybody has areas where they excel and areas where they don't. By doing these more diverse groupings, you allow people to kind of fit into the right place that they fit in. I think that's really interesting. That's different from like what I would describe as like multiple modes of participation, but it's similar. I think they're kissing cousins at least. It's like multiple modes of participation. There's a lot of like good academic research around the idea of like legitimate peripheral participation, which is the idea that in a more like situated learning environment, you often have somebody who's like just observing. They're there, like they're not really engaged in like what's going on, but they are observing because they're just trying to like make sense of it and figure out like where their entry point is and how they want to enter and engage. And so like you have just like a lot of diversity.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the connections here to lifelong learning and, connection to, it's hard to, again, not knowing Pokemon, it's hard to make the connection to what are they actually learning here as opposed to practicing a skill. I was curious, are these people who have just felt a connection to it, or are they getting into it as adults and going to watch just, like someone would watch NASCAR or basketball or something?
Yeah. There is the phenomenon that I have learned of called Pokedads, of which I am one, which is like you weren't into it as a kid yourself, and you've gotten like kind of pulled into it by your own kids. And I'm pretty shocked by like how deep even that goes. Cause at this point, like I play, like, and I play on my own sometimes. Like after my kids go to bed, and sometimes in Pokemon Live playing other people because I enjoy it. But also because like, as far as like the things that you're learning, there is a real strategy component to it because you have to build this complementary deck of 60 cards, all of these different potential capabilities. And so the deck building in itself is a very complicated strategy exercise. And then you have the like actual in situ, like you're playing your cards and things don't always play out the way you want to. And your opponent has things that they're doing. And you have to be able to think and respond to what's going on. In terms of like situated learning, that stuff's really valuable. Like to what you were saying earlier, where you've got to respond relatively quickly and you've got to be able to think through it. And it cultivates that ability to read and react and take in lots of information and process it and make sense of it and then understand. Like, this is higher order thinking that they're doing.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was thinking as you were saying it. What you're describing is you're learning critical thinking skills and strategy and planning and things like that that are among those things that, when you talk about what we're trying to prepare our kids for, when they get out into the world after school, people are looking for critical thinking and strategy and reasoning. And so that's a really interesting argument for, making a game that's very much like Pokemon that's teaching those things without specifically having instruction on it.
And it kind of feels like at this point we have to like just disclaim that this is not sponsored content. Like, this is just organic
yes,
discussion.
We're not getting any money from Pokemon. Though if they do want to contact us about that, we are open to the conversation.
Yeah. What's also been interesting now to me, like, and I think this is like, to me, this is just the icing on the cake, but seeing then how it feeds into like kind of the lower level informational skills. Like my middle son, in the second half of the school year this year, they started getting into like multiplication and division and stuff. He rocked that. He rocked it because he already knew how to do all of it from playing Pokemon. He had like figured it out. And this was where he was now being given kind of like the formal knowledge of understanding what multiplication and division are and how they work. But like, he was like, oh yeah, like I already know how to take like a number and you have to break it into its component parts and divide it out because I've had to figure out this is how strong my attack is. This is how many hit points the other player has. How many attacks do I need to do before I knock them out?
Well, and it's exactly like those word questions that you would get in a math class, except that in this case, it's backed by that intrinsic motivation of wanting to master Pokemon. And, what I was talking about with adult learning and motivation and all of that stuff, it's made it really real for him to want to learn math. And then going and actually doing the formal math, it actually makes more sense because it's been situated like that.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Exactly. It's really cool.
If you were put in charge, what grade is your son in where he rocked the division?
Listen, guys, this is very hard. I don't know how to translate to the American system. I think he is in grade 3. He just finished grade 3 in the American system, I think.
So this is the 9-year-old.
Yeah. That's good. That means I think I translated that right.
Yeah, I think you did.
So if let's say you were magically put in charge of rebuilding the math curriculum up until that age, and you can start wherever you want, you can change however you want. Based on what you've seen of them at these Pokemon tournaments and how they're structured, and then how well he performed in the classroom, how would you think about restructuring just that one class and that one classroom, right? The environment within that room.
I don't think that any single game in and of itself would be sufficient for this. So like, I think a lot of it has to come back to like the principles underlying it rather than say like, let's take the dynamics and mechanics of the Pokemon card game and apply it to elementary school maths. I don't think that would work. But in terms of like where those principles are, so I think probably one of the biggest things that I would look at is probably thinking a lot less linear and sequential and more about conceptual exposure. And so coming up with the kind of situated experiences that give you the like kinds of conceptual exposure and looking for, to the point of like different modes of participation, looking for where somebody latches onto one of those things. So And then at the point that you latch on, you start to go deeper. And then as you start to go deeper in one, you now start to connect out to others. But that you might have some kids where it's the first concept that's introduced, there's something really situated and it clicks. And they're like, ooh, I want to keep going with this. Whereas you might have some kids that first one, it's like, yeah, not quite. And so then you go into the second one and maybe that's not quite clicking either. You go into the third one. And finally, like there's something where you find the thing that like really catches for them. And then you have to then understand the inner relationship between all of those different concepts. And there are some things that I think are actual within mathematics, like actual hierarchies of understanding. Like I think it's pretty difficult to go to multiplication without addition.
Mm-hmm.
Your pedagogical content knowledge, math nerd listeners might take me to task for this. And I'm definitely not an expert on it. But there is definitely an interrelatedness of it. And so recognizing that there are probably multiple different entry points and being able to see how you take the learner and give them exposure to lots of those different entry points and guide them through the entry point that works for them. That's probably how I would want to think about that differently.
I love this concept. I love this thing. And I haven't heard it before. So if it's educational theory, I'm behind, but conceptual exposure is a really interesting way to think about that, where, maybe, and this might be sort of gamification or, a lot of these principles, that seems to be like a great place to start thinking about it is how do you expose the underlying concepts to people in a way that kind of hooks them? Like there's this to relate. By the way, reading your post, I just thought of jujitsu the entire time because it's a lot of the same dynamics. But there's a game in the kids class that I was watching them play the other day. It was like a dog chase. And the kids think that they're pretending to be dogs and chasing the other students who are running by. What they're actually learning is how to move their hips effectively on the ground. Because all of the same mechanics for how you would move on the ground in that position are the same mechanics on how you would want to do it. And so they show them, oh, no, look, if you move your hip this way, you can actually stretch further. You can actually move it in this direction. And the kids just love playing the game. They play the game at the end of every class. And, are they learning jujitsu in specific? No. But are they learning the most important thing that's probably going to help every other thing they do? Yes. And I'm wondering if maybe the way to think about this is like the concepts are actually the trunk of the tree, and sort of some of the hard informational facts are the branches and the leaves. Like if you actually start with these conceptual trunks, it's a lot easier to attach these things later on.
I think that's an apt metaphor.
One of the things that I know that you're a big fan of, or at least I think you're a big fan of, I classify you in my own head as a big fan of this. So I'm going to pigeonhole you for.
I'm so excited to hear what you're about to say.
Like to do project-based learning. Mm-hmm. I know, like my understanding from you is that you really enjoy developing curriculums in project-based learning. How does a lot of the concepts that you've taken away from Pokemon, from gamification, all these things, how does that play into a lot of the project-based learning curricula that you build? And I could be incorrect on that project-based learning.
No, I think you're not wrong about that. And I mean, I think I would also throw on a modifier as well that I think particularly what I'm really into is project-driven and more like self-directed or like interest-driven learning. I've had to reckon with this a lot over the last few months, how this is different. The idea of saying to kids, like, here is a project that we have designed for you and you go do it. And we've got all the different scaffolds and structures around it to help you with it, is very different and taps into a very different kind of set of skills than saying, what do you want to work on? How do we help you figure out what you want to work on, what you should be working on, and how to like initiate and engage with that? That those are very different things. I'm particularly drawn to that latter one though. I think that's super fascinating, but I think both are fun. And I think I'm probably more interested in how you build the environments for that versus just the curriculum. More of like, how do you build kind of organic, self-sustaining environments around that?
Yeah, I'm really interested in your approach to designing sort of project-based curricula, because, and specifically, my concern with it. I've seen two flaws in those designs, and I'm kind of curious how you build around them and how maybe some of these principles apply.
Mm,
The first is that, to our earlier metaphor, it ends up being a bunch of leaves with no tree trunk,
mm,
right? It's like, here's a bunch of concepts in physics or in history and math, but no real through line to how to tie that together. And so the students come out with like these slivers of understandings across topic, but no real depth of the domain. That's a problem that I've seen happen. And the other is the assumption that every student is interest driven.
mhm,
Um, and I'm curious. Like, a lot of my
mm.
experience is students who sort of show up expecting to be spoon fed and then regurgitate, and that so I'm curious about the failure states, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm going to pick up on the second one there first, just because it is directly relevant to some work that I've been doing. So this summer, I'm working with the Reinvention Lab, which is kind of like the R&D wing of Teach for America. And we have been designing these, they're basically like 2-week pop-ups. We've run them. Today's the last day that we're running them in our second site. We'll kick off next week in the third site. And these pop-ups are based on basically the hypothesis that every student, I would say every person, but in this case, we're just really specifically focused on 9th and 10th graders, that everyone has like an interest driven project in them. And it's more just about how do you elicit that and then support it. And I don't think that I was totally convinced that that hypothesis would prove itself to be true 6 weeks ago. And today, like July 13th, I am much more convinced of it. What we had done was we had built different tools. And in a lot of cases, like working from some different Gen AI things and seeing like a lot of it really working. And I want to throw in like what I think is a really critical caveat, which is, so like in this one that we're wrapping up today, the students that we're working with are kids who are in summer school. Like they have to be in summer school because for one reason or another, they didn't pass the academic year. So we're not working with like the academic superstars. We're not in like the most resource rich environment with the most privileged students. This is like a typical ish student. Similarly, in like our first test, we had a similar type of population. And so it's not just like, well, yeah, you can do that with like the really already self-motivated, really sharp kids. This is a different thing where, I mean, I was doing an interview with one of the participants yesterday, and she was like, I came into this and I had never done anything like this before. I didn't know what to expect out of it, but like, I have these things, and this is like being in a space where I've been encouraged to let my strengths come through has really allowed me to function differently. And she said something that like I'm still a bit shook by. She was like, I'm a little bit worried that this might have ruined me for normal school this year.
Yeah, I think it probably will ruin her for going back to normal school, because she's going to see what education actually could be and what interest-driven education can be and go, oh God, now I've got to do the next chapter because it's the next chapter, and that's no fun anymore. Not that it ever was. But I guess just one way to sort of wrap this is thinking of that girl in particular, right? But all students that you've seen go through this program, you've seen this work now. So what are your takeaways on this? That, if you could give one piece of advice to teachers who are in a traditional classroom, who have those students who are not excelling in a traditional curriculum, what's a piece of advice that you would give them on implementing some of your learnings from, whether it's from this TFA experience or from Pokemon or from anything, to really bring in gamification in a meaningful way into what is currently a more traditional classroom experience?
It's a good question. Okay. If I'm talking to somebody in a traditional classroom and we're talking about kids that they have who are not thriving in that space, First of all, I would say, don't even worry about the concept of gamification, because that will probably lead you to a system of just attach points to it, and then I'll throw up. I think the thing that I would say is just chuck out all of the assumptions around what that kid needs to be able to do based on, we know the pressures. There's the pressure of, there's a state standardized test. There's whatever it is. Right. Just let go of that. Let go of it, at least temporarily. And I think in a lot of cases, we are conditioned in education to do like gap analysis and to look for deficits in our students. And I would just say to invert that. With those students, start with a strengths focus. Like, what are they actually good at? What are they motivated by? What do they care about? Mm-hmm. And then try and meet them there. I think there's a lot more that I would want to see at a more like systemic level. But if you're within the system, mm-hmm. and you've only got, there's limits to how much like actual leverage you have. That I think that's one where you have some real influence.
That's great. It's a great takeaway. Yeah. Well, Seth, I want to just thank you so much for joining us. This has been so much fun talking about just geeking out on education stuff. I don't get to do that enough. And hearing about the experiences you've had thinking about gamification and why, as we titled this, gamification that doesn't suck could actually make for a really good educational experience. It's been great to hear what you're doing and how you're thinking about this. Thank you so much for taking part.
This was really fun, guys. I agree. I don't get to geek out about this nearly as much as I would like to.
That's why we created this space.
Absolutely.
It's a Pokemon tournament for the educationally interested.
Are you guys trying to catch them all?
Pokemon tournament.
Kind of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Send us more guests.
No, if I catch him, I'm going to keep him. We'll have to trade.
Oh, yeah, we've got to battle him for the guests.
We have to trade Joe because he didn't show up.
Yeah, well, he didn't show up. That's his problem.
All right, Seth. Good to see you, man. Thanks for doing this.
Yep. See you guys.
Okay, folks. Thanks for joining us, and always keep learning. Did you learn something just now? Get the full episode of Ways We Learn wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, we'd love to get your rating or review.